When we are actively practicing our resilience, it is happening in some of the most frightening, gut-wrenching, unexpected turn of events that we had always hoped to avoid or never anticipated. And it is the worst. And that pain can be so overwhelming to the point where it's like, my job today is just like to keep bringing oxygen into my body and like letting it out. Like that is the full complement of how I can show up in the world today. Like it gets hard. And one of the things that has just been so helpful for me in these moments is to remind myself that none of the pain that we experience is wasted.
The topic of resilience is something that's super fun, and I want to dive deep into that. So I want all of our listeners to know that's something we're going to talk about in depth, and we're going to learn a lot about your book and kind of the why and the how of doing this process. But first, it's important to know about you, the human. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your story, and maybe what drove you to this study.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I love that we get to ground into who I am as a human first, or that you start with that humanistic perspective. I think it's so powerful, right? To ground into the core of who we are. So this is a question that my publisher asked me to answer in the context of writing the book. And it's one of those moments, right, where I had thought that the resilience stuff started one place. And then as I started to reflect on it as part of the writing, it was like, oh, actually, there's a bit of a different origin story here that I get to give voice to. So what I would have said before I wrote the book is I would have talked to you about my graduate school experience. I would have talked to you about early on in graduate school being a part of this amazing team that got to collect interviews from women that were living in rural Maryland, heading up their households, partnered or single, and they were grappling with food sustainability and financial security in rural areas, right? So it's like the study of rural women and like how are the rural women doing in this area. So we interviewed them for 3 years in a row, and then we analyzed their qualitative interviews. And I won't go deep on all the like empirical like research, stuff, but what was important was we looked at factors that promoted resilience. And in this particular group, right, having access to transportation, a vehicle that could get you to work, to the grocery store, medical care when your family needed it in a rural area where there's not public transportation, that was a differentiator. That by and large was the greatest thing that created resilience, was having access to their own vehicle or transportation. Okay, fast forward to now I'm in my pre and postdoctoral fellowships in neuropsychology at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I've got people that I'm working with and their families that have had brain injuries and spinal cord injuries, right? And this is a long-term rehabilitation process. So even though I'm the brand new fellow, right, I'm looking at people's files who have had their injury months or even years before. And what I'm recognizing is that their prognosis that was written in the file at the time of the injury is almost always wrong, right? They're doing better than we thought, or they're not doing as well as we thought. The prognosis is wrong. So that got me thinking. And of course, the department head at the time was very, very generous. And he's like, well, go figure out what's going on. I was like, okay, right? And so what we found, again, not getting too deep into the details, right, is that here again, when we looked at all of the factors, race, gender, ethnicity, age, marital status, having access to reliable transportation. And of course, this is in the age before like Uber and Lyft, right? This is one of the significant differentiators between the people that do better, sorry about that, after their injury. So I'm like, right? And I wish I could tell you that I was like smart enough to put this together like overnight or in a matter of weeks. It actually took years for me to figure it out. And here's what I figured out. Transportation is transformative, right? And I thought, if these women living in rural areas and these primarily men that have brain injuries and spinal cord injuries in their 18 to 25 is the group that's most susceptible. Couldn't be more different. And yet here's a single factor. Here's a single factor that's promoting resilience. And I started to think, what if there are factors? What if there are behaviors that we can engage in that are within the span of our control, that when we implement these behaviors, anytime challenge, change, and complexity, or the 3 Cs, show up in our lives, that we too, like the transportation, could create a better outcome for ourselves? Do these factors exist? And so that kind of aha moment has been part of launching me on this journey. I want to stop there and turn it over to you, Scott, because I've been just talking.
No, it's
And
great.
I also will acknowledge in our subsequent conversation that I did tease the fact that where I thought things started did not start there. So there is another component to the story about where it started for me as the human.
Yeah,
But let me stop there.
no, isn't it funny how so many times, as we get older and we look back on our path, it feels when you're going through it that nothing's connected. Like it's so often that there's this disconnection. You're like, why am I doing this right now? Like, what does this have to do with anything I've done? And then you write a book, okay, or you go through the journey of pulling all this stuff together over your career, and you start to look at the lines and how connected they actually are, and how one thing often leads you to another. Do you find that often in your path and as you went through this process?
I love that question. Absolutely. And this is something that I think has been hanging in the ether of my mind, if you will. So I love that you're bringing it up and giving me an opportunity to actually get reflect on it and give voice to it before it flits away again, right? Um, and here's what I'll say about that. I feel like our day-to-day experience is like a dot, right? And in that day-to-day experience, those dots oftentimes feel like a scatter plot. Like there's no pattern, there's no rhyme or reason, right? And it's only, I think, over time and oftentimes in retrospect or hindsight that we get to see the line that's the through point for how everything connects with that added perspective. And one thing that I think about this, it's like a wonderful example of it, and it's so resonant for me in my life, and I'm curious for you, Scott. Um, some of your listeners will be familiar with this film that came out. Gosh, I feel like it's maybe been 12 or 15 years now, called Slumdog Millionaire. And it was so popular, and it was kind of this indie film, and it came out of everywhere. And there's really beautiful elements to it. And the piece that really stands out to me today is how these sort of seemingly unimportant or inconspicuous experiences that he had in this really profound and important moment of his life all had that through line and actually gave him the opportunity. Um, so
That's a
yeah,
great analogy. I've never thought of the movie and that thought process together. So closing that gap for me, I remember the movie. I saw it in the theater. I remember walking out going, wow, what a phenomenal movie. You know how sometimes the Academy Award winners and the big Oscars are not the best movies. They're just the ones that the critics think are the best. And that was one that was extremely powerful. And I did feel the same way when I wrote my book. One of the first questions in the process of getting it all organized was, Scott, think of all the times that you failed and how they may have affected the trajectory of your life. Like, were they major failures or minor failures? And what were they in the big scheme of life? And sometimes they seemed like the biggest thing in the world, and other times they were very minute, but they turned out to be catalysts for major opportunities. And so you pulling down the movie Slumdog Millionaire is a perfect example for everybody listening to really understand what we're talking about. We're talking about, in that scatter chart that you made, is how aligned the scatter chart could actually be when you look back. It feels like they're all over the place, but they're actually so organized. And it might be a cleaner line as time goes on. Like that scatter plot looks like it's just all over the place in the current day, but it
Mhm.
it moves on from there, and it looks like it's a little more linear or a little more on an upward trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah. I love what you said. And um, tell me if you don't want to take things in this direction,
Oh,
Scott.
I definitely want to. Any direction you want to go is where I want to take it. That's what we do
Oh
here.
my gosh. Oh, come on. You're too kind to share your interviewer platform with me in this way. Well, you said the F word a minute ago, which is failure, of course. And I'm curious from your perspective, when we think about sort of the high impact life, right? How do you think about failure? Because I'm in this moment. Let me show you my failure cards, right? I'm in this moment where there's a lot of cliche around failure, right? To say like I don't know, failure doesn't exist or something like that. I don't think that's quite true. Like I think failure is a thing. Like I think things fail. Um, and and again, it's something that I'm working through in real time. But this idea of like um that we sort of have to have the down moments to get the lessons for the up moments, that it's an inevitable part of the journey as opposed to being something that is an outlier or is something that we need to be ashamed of or we've somehow come off course. Um, and I'm curious if you have thoughts or insight about that or kind of a framework for how here, like, as we think about the high impact life, if you have a way of characterizing failure.
Yeah, I first of all, I think we should fail often and regularly, which means that we're putting ourselves out into the world. It's like in a
Mhm.
relationship. When you have a relationship with somebody, we've all had friends that say, "Oh, we never fight." And you're like, "Okay, well, you guys haven't gotten into the true vulnerability of who you might be and how that person may respond to that." And when I say fight, I don't mean like argue aggressively, like
You mean like a
disagreement.
couple,
I mean
like a couple.
like a couple or a
Hmm.
partnership in business, anything that when you actually get to your true authentic life, okay, authenticity in general, I think what you're getting at is you're getting at modes where you're going to fail and learn from it. And so I can look
Hmm.
at life. John Maxwell has a saying that says sometimes you fail, sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. And that failure is really just a learning lesson. And without the failures of being that authentic version of yourself, it's very difficult. I have two sons who play soccer all the time, and what I could tell you is I want them to fail every time they're on the field. And I'll tell you why, because that means they're really putting all of themselves out there, and they're losing the ball. They're trying something new. They're getting into a position that makes them think outside the box. I feel like it's empowering to go through that process. And when I looked back, I mean, there were things, just to go back to that point of the story to help the thought process here for anyone listening. I didn't think of all the things that I considered failures. And I came home and I asked my wife, I said, I have to go through this exercise. And then I kind of changed to, I get to go through this exercise. And
Love that.
and
Love
it
that
yeah,
shift in
it was
language.
huge. It was huge. And she started like texting me later in the next like 3 days, like all the different things that I had failed at or that had been major setbacks in my career or my life that I might not have even visualized as setbacks. I had
Now,
just
for some spouses, that might have been a career-ending move, to start texting like a
all
litany
your
of all
failures.
of your partner's failures. But it seems like you two have a very collaborative, collegial. You were able to move through that.
Yeah, I think ultimately we got married really young. And so in our early 20s, so I like to tell people that she allowed me to grow up and stop being the big baby that I was, and to grow into the man that I should have been. And so a lot of that is and I've been a directional star of what we could accomplish and what we could be together. And so when you put those two things together, I think that failure is inevitable to have as a part of that conversation. And so I'm very comfortable, because when you're babies, you say things you would never say as adults, you know? And so we are people that grew up together in a way. And so I think that's why that comfortability existed. But it was just little things that I had forgotten, and they were for your um for your expert status and resilience, they were a lot of moments of resilience. They were a lot of
Of course.
moments of
Yes.
failure that I had to overcome. And it made you think in a completely different way, but you had to mentally shift. Am I going to acknowledge and move forward? Or am I going to sit here in this space and just exist? And I never,
Mhm.
a lot of times I didn't exist in that space long enough to actually remember it, which is why she was reminding me of it. And so, you know, I think I love your thought process. I love the way that you're going down this path. And I think people don't talk about the things that we feel or are socially failures too. There's a lot of things that people think are failures, like doing a video. If you go out and you start doing video and you do a video and someone will say, I can't believe you did that video. Like it had like 5 different parts where you made a mistake or you did this. And I'm like, yeah, that's what authenticity is all about. Like I was failing and you got to see it. And that means
Mhm.
that you actually in my opinion, you'll appreciate it more. So do you find yourself leaning into that, or do you find yourself as you go through this thought process and you explore this idea, what is your insight in that failure component? Do you feel like it's just empowering to accomplish it on a regular basis?
Mm. Yeah. Oof. There's so much to unpack there. Gosh, three sort of facets of that come to mind right away. The first facet I think that comes up for me when you ask me that question is, I don't know, for lack of a better way of characterizing this, it's like the capital F failures versus the lowercase failures,
Sure.
right? So if I'm kind of talking about like lowercase failures, you know, so I worked inside of corporate for a number of years and as a management consultant. So um, when I led large teams in executive leadership development and talent strategy at Nike and global leadership development at Cigna, when my teams would come to me and they'd say, okay, Taryn, we made a mistake, right? Like, first of all, there's a lot of courage, I think, that's required for someone who reports to me to come and even have that conversation, right? And what I always told my team in those moments and in moments where we were not having that conversation to encourage them for the future is I would say, if, you know, has this happened before, right? And they would typically say no. And I would say, okay, well, if it hasn't happened before, then right now the moment that we're in is a lesson, right? It's not a mistake. Now, down the road, if it happens again, then yes, it is a mistake because we have failed to learn from the information that's been put in our path. But right now, it's a lesson. So let's orient around how we can learn this lesson. So the first thing is, you know, not to, I'm not on the end of the continuum right now where I'm so, you know, failure doesn't exist, right? But I think it does exist, right? Like it is a thing and things fail. But I think all the things that we think are failures are not necessarily failures. And I'll say what I mean about that in a moment. But the first thing is recognizing that I think we also can over-index on this failure language around like, oh, I made a mistake. And I'm like, wait, hold on. Like, is it really? Or are we just in a moment of learning? Right. So I think that distinction between learning and lessons versus kind of mistake and failure and chastising ourselves is really important. That's one. Um, Two is, um, you know, I think there's a lot of false positives in our society on failure, right? And what I mean by that is people will use language like a failed marriage, right? And, you know, depending on your kind of spiritual, emotional orientation to that, I know you have faith as one of your 4 pillars. You know, there is a theology and a mindset that guides that. And you know, I think there's an opportunity to learn from every single experience and interaction that we have. I have been divorced, and I don't talk about those relationships as being failed, right? I talk about those relationships as some of the most profound and prolific. I'm getting emotional talking about it, right? Because it's so, moments that catalyzed within me these incredible lessons and this opportunity to step into my full strength or my full power, or my voice, or to see where I was um, having a pattern of wounding that was getting in the way of what I truly wanted to experience inside of a romantic relationship, you know? So that's the second thing. I think we have a lot of false positives around failure that aren't truly failures. There's in my mind, there's a very significant difference that exists across a wide chasm between something that ends and something that fails. And I think the vast majority of things in our life will end, right? Um, Including this life, right? But if you think about it, there's almost nothing that's been constant over the course of our entire lives. So endings endings are not failures, right? And then the third thing is I really see a difference across genders on how failure is experienced by people individually and also how it's perceived in our society, right? So women and girls, we have a tendency to be more perfectionistic, and therefore when things don't go well, we tend to take that harder, right? And by harder, that means that we internalize it as being something that is related to our personality, stable qualities that exist within ourselves. We believe that it's so we personalize it. We think about it as being pervasive, meaning we think it's going to last forever. Like I'll never be able to, blah blah blah. Um, Sorry, we think of it as being pervasive in the sense that it defines us completely, right?
Okay.
Like because I had this failure, this is the full complement of the definition of who I am. And we think about it as being permanent, meaning lasting forever, right? So I think this sort of failure, these moments of lessons, they hit women and girls harder. And women and girls have been historically less likely to come back because of what that blow. And then societally, um, I think we still live in a world, if you look at kind of, VCs and entrepreneurship and funding, where there seems to be more grace, I would say, from my perspective, for men who have founded something that has not worked, right? Versus women who have founded something that have not worked. And there seems to be a discrepancy between how we make sense of that. And for the man that founded something that didn't work, a lot of times he's sort of like lauded as a hero for trying something new. And for the woman, it can become like a black mark on her entrepreneurial record.
Yeah, it's almost like the pressure is more significant, and maybe it's just because so many women are charting new paths. So maybe to some
Mhm.
extent, like men have done these types of roles for generations and different levels, but women are getting into some of the things in the last 50 years that are significantly different than the previous 50 years, and technology is also moving so fast. I don't know. I agree. I actually agree with you, and I don't know why it
I
is.
love that
Like
you said actually. You're like, I actually
well,
agree
because
with
as
you.
you were talking, I'm wondering why it is, and I don't know why it is, but I do think that women and young girls especially have more of a perception of how the world sees them, and they do internalize it as who they are. And you said that in a more eloquent way. And I think as a guy, every time you fail at something, you genuinely just go, okay, I'll go do it again. I'll go figure it out. I'll go do it again. I don't care what anybody thinks. A lot of men have that. A lot of men, successful men, have that mentality. And I just want to comment briefly because I love how you talked about failure in relationships, and it's so powerful because what happens is it's not failure, it's growth. And every time that failure exists internally, but it leads to growth, I think that it's actually this rebirth. It's a new beginning. It's not it. You said that you were talking about endings. And the beautiful thing is that endings can be like just the close of a chapter. You wrote a book. And as you finish your book, each chapter has to end and a new chapter begins. And it's really exciting when a new chapter begins. New things happen, rebirth happens. I was listening to one of your podcasts and someone referenced Steve Jobs and how they how Steve Jobs leaving Apple and starting this new endeavor became something that was so great, and it paved the way for him to come back. And some would say that he failed by leaving Apple and not having the control he had. But in actuality, it goes back to our scatter chart, to your scatter chart analysis earlier, which is it was all part of the plan. It's all part of the path. And when you can actually go back into those things, use them for strength, it's really a growth moment. It's not a failure moment at all.
Yeah.
If you want to unpack my actual comment too, by the way, sorry to interrupt. If you want to unpack that, I'm open to diving down that depth, because I don't know why I said I actually agree with you, except that I think I started out by wondering, because I am a man, I was like, why is it different? I wonder why it's different. I wonder if I felt that way. So it wasn't like it's just as you got through the process, I was like, it really is so different. And it's so true. And feeling things is something that men often numb as they grow up, where and again, we're generalizing. I know the world is a different world a lot of times today, but if we're just utilizing traditional male and female mindset, there is more of a feeling and a nurturing mindset that is less natural for the guy. And so if he's reverting and pushing down all those feelings throughout time, failure would become a little easier for them and would be accepted a little bit easier. An analogy I'll use, and I'll pause, is this. The MIT Age Lab does all these analysis every year on identifying like where technology is going to take the next generation. And cars that can drive by themselves are ready. They are ready. Like they could be everywhere, but we will not have them everywhere. And you know why? Because we actually have grace for humans that make mistakes in all ways when they have accidents. But when technology makes it, we have no grace. Like the one Tesla car that accidentally hits something it shouldn't have hit, or it's on the news, it's immediate, and it immediately shuts down the technology. And they're like, oh, we're not ready for this. But the example is humans get in accidents every single day. The person in front of you accidentally slams on their brakes and you end up running into them. At what point does technology and humans, actually have that grace? And I don't know that it ever exists. And so that's what I was thinking about as you were saying, is it just this embedded? Is it just this embedded? Like we have grace because it's always been that way for men. Fail often, grow, fail, grow. And for women, there is a perfection. There's a higher standard. There's a difference, and it's a new endeavor. That was my thought process. And I was prattling on now, so I will pause.
No, I love that. You prattled not at all. I heard no prattling.
Okay,
I heard
good.
no prattling. Yes, that was so good. I'll just sort of start here. When you said the word actually, I took that to mean, oh, this is cool. Like we just met. We don't know a lot about each other. Dr. Taryn Marie's come on the show. She's given a perspective that kind of has three parts to it. And this is fascinating because I think I can resonate with all three of these parts of this person who just came on the show, and we don't have like a lot of kind of shared background and interaction. So that's the way I took. Like,
Perfect.
I actually agree with you, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, look, we just met and we've like sort of we're resonating here. So that's how I took it. I love that you brought up the part about standards. That to me is so important. And I think there's so many things to say here, right? The difference in terms of the standards that we have for men and the standards that we have for women, it starts super young, right? And I have two boys who are today 11 and 8. And, I hear all the things about like, they're constantly like jumping on each other and like doing WWE moves
Yeah.
and all this stuff. And there's a kind of this sense of like, oh, they're just being boys, right? Um, Whereas, we don't tend to give women that grace, you know? And and I think at least as a woman, I hear a lot being said about the sort of double standards that benefit men in our society. And there are also double standards that are deeply detrimental to men that in my opinion, haven't been given as much voice and as much airtime. And you started to allude to one of them, which is men and connectivity to your inner world and your inner process and your inner feelings, right? So I think there's been a lot written, and it's super important around how girls start to pull back in their teen years and lose confidence and aren't going into STEM careers. And um, Rashma Saujani, who's just an incredible warrior for equal pay for women. She wrote a book called Brave Not Perfect, and she founded an organization called Girls Who Code. And she found that when girls were like, I can't do it, if they just like hit the back button a couple of times, all of a sudden this like perfect code had been written. And she'd erased it because she thought it wasn't good, right? So that's happening for girls at ages like 13 and 14. For men, where they're cutting off from themselves, for men, a lot of men in our society, it actually happens a decade earlier, where we say to 3 and 4-year-old boys, don't cry, be strong, shake it off, and we minimize or chastise and send all kinds of messages that it's not okay to be connected to your internal process, or let alone demonstrate it, right? And then men are growing up into adults and get into relationships, and we're like, so how do you feel about that, right?
Fine,
And guys are
fine,
like,
fine,
what? Like,
fine, good.
conditioned out of me like 20 years ago, So, there's all these double standards that exist. And I think one that's really come up around women and this idea of how let me characterize it this way, right? Like how we think of the things that have a different outcome than we had hoped for or imagined, right? So mistakes, lessons, learning, failure, all that stuff. Um, I think there's different standards for women. I think we have really high standards for ourselves. I think the recent Super Bowl, I mean, that's gotten a lot of airtime, literally and figuratively. But the conversations about, Rihanna's Super Bowl performance is just a beautiful, illustrative example of um, difference in standards, right? Like she's performing pregnant, like around her first trimester, which like is a very difficult time for women where you may not be showing as much, but your body's working very hard to like create a human and you're short of breath. And that's, to dance around and do that all in your first trimester. And I think about some of the performances from Super Bowls past, and nobody was like, well, why isn't Snoop Dogg flying through the air? Like, what, where's Snoop Dogg's acrobatics? Why isn't Ice Cube like jumping out of a cake? Like nobody said that. They stand in place, they rap, and they do their thing. So there's just, these sort of incredible double standards that exist in our society that I think feed into how we think about ourselves, how we process the experiences that we have internally, also how society processes those experiences and sort of reflects information back to that. The last thing that I wanted to say here is you said the word pain, and I love that you said that word. I've been going through a moment where I think you're aware, because you've been following my social
Social
media.
media.
I've been going through a moment where I recently ended a relationship, brought a marriage to completion. Um, Not my son's father, but a person that I married after him. And it was a relationship that I had thought would be lifelong, and the marriage itself was actually only 14 months, right? So there's this feeling, within myself, like, well, how did I get that so wrong? Like, what were the factors that I wasn't thinking of there? And what's been interesting is I've gotten to be in studio reading my audiobook in the midst of this transition that I've been in. So I've gotten to read my own work cover to cover back to myself as I'm having this experience. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's I should listen to her more often. She knows what she is talking about, right? There's this part at the end of the book, though, in the third section, where I'm really talking about how do we take the 5 practices of highly resilient people, and uh, what is the practical application of that to life, essentially. So there's a chapter on parenting called Resilient Parenting. There's a chapter on women and leadership. There's a chapter on leaders, teams, and organizations. And then there's some ways that you can systematize or ritualize this, like inside of your life, to start doing more of these practices that are going to lead to what we call your resilient movement, right? And what came up for me as I was writing the book was this idea that when we engage in these behaviors, it's in a moment. It's in a moment where we're facing typically unanticipated challenge, change, and or complexity. And in that moment, we get to make a decision about how we want to respond to what's happening. And when we start making more decisions and behaving in ways that are going to create a better outcome, this creates momentum from that moment, right? And then that momentum gets to become, in my mind, a movement, right? A movement for us to embrace and engage resilience to a greater degree as humans, um, collectively, and it gets to be our own individual movement, right? Like now I take this work, this way that I have looked at how it is we can create a more positive and productive outcome through the 5 practices of highly resilient people, through doing these 5 things that will allow us to most effectively move beyond these inevitable moments of challenge. And but then that becomes bigger than me, right? It's not then just about my work or the 5 practices. It's how we birth this into the world and allow it to sort of percolate in a way where we each then get to create our own resilient movement. What does it look like for me to engage in this in my life? And one of the last sections that I wrote in the book, the section's entitled Pain. And I might get emotional talking about this too, which I want to tell you, I feel very grounded and comfortable getting emotional. So please don't worry about me. And, hopefully this will feel all right for you and our listeners. And what I wrote in that section on pain is that in my experience, and I have like faith, a relationship with a spiritual and divine energy that feels like a god, to me, and a relationship with the universal sort of interworkings and serendipity of the universe. And for me, God and the universe go together. The sort of energetic force that surrounds us. That's all I know about anything, basically. I don't even know it. That's all I believe. And that's not all I believe, but it's the core of it. Anyway, so the section about pain, and I said, in my experience, God and the universe don't waste an ounce of pain in our formation. And that has been so instructive for me on so many occasions, and is instructive for me in this moment, because when we're going through hard things, and I'll just say, Scott, you said at the beginning of the program, you were like, resilience is fun. And I was like, yes, but not really.
Yeah.
It's not really fun. actually it's like super messy. And when we're like drawing on our resilience, it can be one of the most messy, unbalancing, what in the world is happening? Like, where are the guideposts? Catalytic, chaotic moments. And in my and so it's hard stuff, right? And one of the things that I haven't necessarily resonated with around conversations that are being had in other places around resilience, and I think there's value to everything, is oftentimes resilience is characterized as fun. Like, I've never seen this before, but I'm just going to use it as an example. It's like, we're all baking like resilience cupcakes. Yay! I mean, yo, I love cupcakes as much as the next person, right? Um, Maybe more than the next person. And, you know, I think what we get to recognize is that, like, when we are actively practicing our resilience, it is happening in some of the most frightening, gut wrenching, unexpected turn of events that we had always hoped to avoid or never anticipated. And it is the worst, and that pain can be so overwhelming to the point where it's like, my job today is just like to keep bringing oxygen into my body and like letting it out. Like, that is the full complement of how I can show up in the world today. Like, it gets hard. And one of the things that has just been so helpful for me in these moments is to remind myself, in the experience that I've had and the belief that I hold, that none of the pain that we experience is wasted. And just when I think, I'll speak from my perspective, just when I think I can't take anymore, and what is the darn point of going through all of this? I can see, going back to our scatter plot and the way that things line up, I can see that with a little bit of, um, a retrospective, a little bit of hindsight, I can say, oh, and I can see how every drop of that pain was used in my formation and in my growth after some time. And that has been, for me, sort of the thought and the belief, one of the significant thoughts and beliefs that has gotten me through those tough moments.
Well, I'm grateful that you felt comfortable to share some of the pain as you experience it and with our audience, because I think people feel this every day. And when I think of resilience as fun, I think of results as fun. The results of resilience are fun. And
That could be our tagline: resilience, terrible. Results, fun.
yeah. And you said, I want to hit on a couple of things that you said because they were very powerful. Number one, I put a ton of videos out and we're launching a YouTube channel and we're doing all these things that it's funny because people will constantly text or DM me a video that I put out with a message that says,
Mm.
you don't know how powerful that was. Thank you so much. Or like, and I go back and watch it, and I needed to be reminded of that in that moment. So what people need to understand is life is imperfect. We are all imperfect. And if you think that the person that writes about the resilience as being the expert doesn't actually experience it, go through it, is a part of it, then you're the one that's creating the wrong version of what it actually is. Every video I put out is everything we write, everything we do that we put out into the world, you, myself, and anyone we do podcasts with, is all about the imperfections that we've learned from mistakes and that we constantly usually have to remind ourselves of as we go through the journey of life, because life is imperfect. The other thing that you had as a trend line of everything you just said was the word movement. The word movement is powerful. Some days you wake up and there's pain, and just to get through the day was movement. But every day you move, your scatter chart goes from fully all over the place to tighter and tighter and tighter because you're moving towards your purpose. You're moving towards something bigger than yourself. The universe, God, whatever it may be, there's a mission, there's a journey, and you're on it. And that pain that you're talking about starts with movement. And the movement is something that I really, really love as a trend, because it's like the worst thing in the world is if you have severe back pain or you have any type of pain, like a lot of times with back pain, they'll be like, well, you got to move more. And yet every time you move more, it hurts more. And then the more you move, the less it hurts. But until you get past that initial pain, it's really difficult to be able to function. And the only thing I can equate it to on a daily basis, I've been doing cold plunges for a lot of years. And
Mm,
and I don't care how many times you do it, I don't ever want to do it. Okay. I get up, I do it every day. I did one this morning. I got out of the sauna, I got into the plunge, and in the first 30 seconds, your brain is like, I don't even want to do this. I don't like this. I don't want to do it. And I've been doing it for years and I still have to walk myself through it. And then once
mhm,
the difference is, this is the muscle difference, right? The difference is the longer you've done it, the more you know you're okay. And the more you know you're okay, the longer you can stay in it. And the less likely
mm,
you are to get out or jump out. The more relaxed you are as you separate from it, the more calm you are as you go through the movement. And so I also like to think, I'm going to go way back in our conversation to when I started talking about relationships and the people that say they never argue or fight and they haven't built that
mm,
authenticity I was talking about. One of the things
mhm,
that ADHD is a beautiful thing when you can go back because your brain is constantly spinning and you can see it all as clearly as day. But when I go back to that, I talk about muscles, right? Muscles, if you work out, you're doing these small tears in your muscles every single time to get stronger. And every
mhm,
single day, you're getting a little bit stronger with a little bit more pain. And it hurts.
mhm.
The next day you wake up, if you did legs, you are so uncomfortable. Your bum hurts, your thighs hurt, like everything hurts when you walk down the stairs in the morning. But you know that in order to have true growth, true value, hit your vision or your goal, you've got to have those small little tears. And the
Mhm,
pain is part of the journey. The
mhm,
imperfection is part of the journey. And what I love is your authenticity and your message is part of what will make this book do so well. Because if you think, anyone listening to this, that life is perfect, we're all lying to ourselves. It is completely made up of scatter charts of imperfection. But when they start to line up together, how cool is it? How cool is it to look back and know that you've been through pain and you've made it through, even if it's just today?
I mean, can we give you like a round of
No,
applause for that? Like that was amazing. Like you took like pain and your resilient movement and then the scatter plot and you like put it all together into like a cohesive framework. And I was like, whoa, I gotta take some notes. This is good. Like I hadn't even thought about the relationship between pain and movement in the physical body. That's so cool.
I feel like it's been a journey of my life forever. I have to fail. I have to experience pain. I have to learn from it. I have to grow from it. I have to look at things as new beginnings. These are all part of
Mhm.
our conversation. So for the listener that stayed with us through all the things that we're talking about, even
Thank
parenting,
you for still being
yeah. Yeah, thank you. Because the imperfection even of parenting, like, I always think about when I talk about being a dad and I give lots of advice and I fail lots of times. And I hear my dad give advice about different things. And you listen to your parents talk about stuff and you're like, I don't remember it like that. And
here.
my
Mhm.
kids will do the same thing. No one will be a judge of you more strictly than your own children and your own family and the people that you love the most. But it's all an imperfect journey. It's all part of
Mhm.
this path. And so I just thought that you pulled it all together. All I did was loop the conversations back towards the purpose of where you're going. And when
Mhm.
when you talk about your book, you broke this book into the resilience of everything from parenting. So you have part one, resilience finds you. Part two, your resilient life, the 5 practices of highly resilient people. Part three, your
Mhm.
resilient movement, applying resilience to your life. And as you're talking, I'm looking through your chapters and I'm just saying, okay, um, just on the initial idea of what you're putting out there, people need to get this. They need to read it. They need to learn from it. And
Mhm.
they need to know that you're doing it while you write it. And that's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Um, it's felt really important to me on this journey, this sort of last 2 decades where I've been studying this and wanting to understand first and foremost, are there common threads that we can engage in that will allow us to create a more positive and productive outcome anytime we face challenge, change, and complexity? And, spoiler alert, there are the 5 practices of highly resilient people. Um, and it's felt really important to me to be able to live life in an integrated and I'll say coherent way. Um, and so the first practice, really the foundational practice of resilience, is the practice of vulnerability. And if there's, one sort of concept that I work with that's as misunderstood as resilience, I'll say it's vulnerability. Because oftentimes the messages that we've received about vulnerability is that um, it's about being self-deprecating, it's about degrading ourselves, um, or on the other hand, it's about just showing everyone everything, maybe even a little too much information, TMI. And that's not what vulnerability is. Vulnerability is the ability for us to allow our inside self, our thoughts, feelings, and experiences to, as closely as possible, match the outside self that we are sharing with the world. Now, that's going to look different, the level of vulnerability that we engage in different environments with different people, work and home, people we feel safe with, people we don't. That's going to look different, right? And so our sort of maximum vulnerability or our vulnerability edge, right, is going to be different inside of different conversations and experiences and environments. But the idea, this is tremendously important for a couple of reasons. One, anytime we're going through a challenge, it's very taxing. It takes a lot of energy. And so if we are running what I'll call 2 different human operating systems, right? Feeling and experiencing and thinking one thing on the inside and then doing something else on the outside to cover that up, we're basically like a computer that's running like 2 different operating systems at the same time. So the extent that we can bring those together into one operating system or as close as possible, that conserves energy, especially when we're facing challenge. And vulnerability is the cornerstone of authenticity and empathy, because we can't tap into something authentic within ourselves, or we can't tap into our empathy if we don't first connect to our vulnerability. And so for me, when I think about this idea of living an integrated or a coherent life and being as connected as possible to my own vulnerability, which, by the way, I'm freaking terrible at vulnerability. Like, people have told me, like, this is so great that you're doing this work because, like, you're so, no, like, I have come to vulnerability not naturally. you know, I'm the person on the like high dive that's like, I don't think so. I don't think I can. No, I'm gonna go back down the ladder. Like, I don't. It's just it's a real. It can be a real struggle for me, and then in that sense, I feel that I'm a wonderful person to be sharing this message, because sometimes the person that struggles the most with the thing is the person that gets to be on stage who says, hey, like, this didn't come naturally to me. This is a lot of work and investment. And so it's felt really important to me in doing this work that, similar to the practice of vulnerability, that the way that I show up in life um, is aligned and integrated to the greatest extent possible. We all have our private lives, and like I want to be the person that I say that I am and the person that I want to be as much as I possibly can, and as many interactions as I possibly can, in as many sticky moments as I possibly can.
Yeah, I love it when people define what they want to be, though. And that's part of growth, right? It's part of vision. And, you know, as somebody that loves a great vision, I love listening to someone that's defining a better version of themselves every single day. That's what this podcast is about. A high performance life is about making it through, going through, and making sure that although there is imbalance in life at all times, it's that self-awareness to know where we need to lean back into, because we're not being that version of our person that we believe is fundamental to who we are. If I'm super involved in work or impact or something that's helping other people, but I'm not able to make it to my kids' games and to be present at home or to do the things that I want, then I am failing. But I'm learning as I go, and I'm growing, and I'm just recalibrating constantly. And that's part of life. And I think you sharing vulnerability and even lack thereof or hard to do is exactly what vulnerability is all about. Walk me through just briefly. I know we're getting tight on time. I just want to walk me through the other four, um, so that our listeners, we don't need to give them everything, because then they'll want that we're going to give them a commercial version. So if they like you and they trust you and they've enjoyed listening to you, they're going to want to buy your book. They're going to want to listen to your audiobook. They're going to want to learn from you and follow you on social media, because you put out a lot of good stuff. But walk me through the other four, so at least I can't say that we never hit all five as we finish this.
There we go. We'll never be able to say that. This is the resilience lightning version, right? So practice 2 is the practice of productive perseverance. This means the intelligent pursuit of a goal, and sort of the two poles of knowing when to maintain the mission despite facing challenge, and also when to pivot in a new direction or even wholesale quit when we are recognizing diminishing or significantly diminishing returns. That's practice 2. 3 is the practice of connection, which also has a polarity to it. I don't know if it is a polarity actually. Let me think about that. But it's the connection to ourselves first and foremost, and then the connection to other people. Here's it is. It's not a polarity. It's the intersectionality of how we navigate the connection that we have with ourselves and the connection that we have with others. Practice 4 is gratiosity. So this is a hybrid word. It's a hybrid word
Yeah.
for gratitude and generosity. First and foremost, being able to see the good in challenge and what we learned when we're able to sort of zoom out on that scatter plot, or to see the through line after some time. Nobody's like, great, I have a flat tire. It's wonderful, right? But so it takes some time. And then generosity, being able to draw on our vulnerability in order to generously share our resilient stories with others. And this is important for two reasons. One, it's important for us because in this telling of that story or that narrative, we are solidifying for ourselves the strengths and skills and the identity around how we made it through in our resilience. And we are also offering an opportunity for people to learn from us in our relationships and coaching and mentorship and town halls, where they get to live through that experience vicariously. And often, for people that are maybe in the midst of something similar, it can even be a light that we're shining on their path, or part of someone's survival guide. And then the fifth practice is possibility. And possibility is really about focusing on progress, not getting mired in perfection, as we talked about earlier. And then navigating, this is a polarity, navigating the polarity between risk and opportunity, right? And not over indexing on fear and risk anytime there's a new possibility, and also not over indexing on the shiny newness of the new opportunity without assessing, the risk involved in pursuing that possibility. So that's the 5 practices.
I love it. It's extremely interesting. It's extremely impactful to anyone that's listening. And in order to live a high performance life, resilience is crucial. It's crucial. And so I love the ability for you to define it so quickly in the lightning round. And I think everybody that's listening is going to go out and grab the book. And is it on pre-order right now?
Yeah, it's on pre-order right now. It's so fun. Like, just, I I go to Amazon sometimes just to look at it. It's like watching your child like sleeping in their bedroom. I'm like, I'm just gonna log into Amazon and see my book there, right? Yeah, so it's on pre-sale right now, The 5 Practices of Highly Resilient People, Why Some Flourish and Others Fold. And it'll be live April 18th, and we're so excited. So thank you so much for having me on your show. Thank you, listeners, for being here, for those of you that are still here, for staying till the end. It's just been a delight and honor to share this work with you, Scott, and everyone who's listening.
Yeah, it's my honor as well. Any other places they can find you? Just so our listeners, if they want to find you online, if they want to follow you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, actually, if you go to my website, which is resilience with a C dash leadership, we've got a whole book page there. And if you go through that, into that website, you can join our Resilience Insider list, where you're the first one to find out about events that we're having and giveaways. And if you actually go through the website channel to buy your book, it'll ultimately take you to Barnes and Noble or Amazon, wherever you buy your books. But if you buy through our site, you can actually immediately download the first chapter of the book before it's available.
That's awesome. Dr. Taryn Marie, it's been an honor and a joy. I have so many more questions and things that we could go on and on about. We've had a great time. I know we'll talk again in the future. Thank you for giving our listeners such great value today. And thanks for taking your time to be with me.
It's been a delight and an honor. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you liked it, there's more where this one came from. Click here and enjoy some more.